Everybody, or good afternoon for those of you watching in other parts of the world. My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow here at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center in Jerusalem, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the launch of this fantastic new book, which we're going to be hearing about and talking about. This event was planned some time ago. David Hazony and I discussed it several months ago. And obviously, since the events of October 7th, a lot of the events that we've been doing here, both in English and in Hebrew, have been related to our current situation. And this event, I think, is obviously, as I said, planned many months before, and not directly connected to this to the situation we find ourselves in. But I think that not only does the current situation not absolve us of the responsibility of thinking and talking about the future, but also this war, I think, has shown us just how interconnected the Jewish world is, and how what happens in Israel causes not just ripples, but actually, if you ask some students on certain campuses, tidal waves in diaspora Jewry. So this is as good a time as any to be talking not just about Israeli priorities and the Israeli future, but Jewish priorities. And I think the brilliance of this book lies not only in the brilliance of the writers involved, although also that, of course, but in their diversity. And David Hazony has really done an unbelievable job in finding different Jewish writers who have something profound to say and profoundly different from one another. So how this is going to work, we're going to hear from David. We're then going to hear a conversation with four fantastic contributors to the book, and then there'll be time for some questions from you, from our audience here at the Begin Center. And of course, I should remind you, for those that didn't pre-order a copy of the book is on sale outside, and you can purchase a copy afterwards. For those of you watching on Zoom, if you haven't already seen the Amazon link, we're going to write it in the chat of the Zoom, so you can go straight to Amazon and buy a copy after you've been inspired by what you hear this evening. Okay, let me introduce David Hazony, an award-winning editor, translator, author, Steinhardt Senior Fellow at the Z3 Project. His newest work, Jewish Priority, 65 Proposals for the Future of Our People, brings together a remarkable array of new essays from across the Jewish world. He's the former editor-in-chief of the journal Azure and was the founding editor of Tower.org. His book, The Ten Commandments, was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Awards, and his translation of Uri Bar Joseph's The Angel was a winner of the National Jewish Book Award. He has a PhD in Jewish philosophy from the Hebrew University, and he lives in Jerusalem. David Hazony.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, everybody. Really happy to, excuse me. Apologize for my post-flu voice. I'm sure all of you have a post-flu voice of your own. I want to say especially good morning to those of you in California watching on Zoom, and midday on the East Coast and anywhere else you may be. It is the deepest nightmare of any author that you've been working on a book for a year, or 2 years, or 10 years, and then all of a sudden some massive world historical event comes along, and just as your book is about to launch, and nobody really wants to talk about a new book at that exact moment. I'd like to just say a few words before I bring up the panelists about why that didn't exactly happen, even though Jewish Priorities was scheduled to launch on October 24th. And yet all of our events happened nonetheless, despite the trauma and horror of October 7th, and maybe because of it. But first I just want to say a few words about what this book is. why it exists at all. We're a people of books, and we have been for thousands of years. We love our Bible, with all of its 24 or 36, depending on how you count, different books in it, stories and laws and prophecies and poems. We're a people of the Talmud, with its thousands of pages and dozens of tractates and volumes and 2 different Talmuds even, and centuries upon centuries of interpretations, capturing our entire people's ideas. And then, in the modern era, we sort of splintered into a million smaller books. Individual writers, individual thinkers, and novelists, and playwrights, and scholars, and polemicists, each one pushing in a different direction. And at a certain point, I think it was around 2020, in the height of the COVID lockdowns, when the publisher Izabella and I had little to do other than talk about books, that the idea came together of an anthology that would encompass somehow the entirety of our people, as absurd as that may sound. But the idea of, the Jewish people as a whole we talked about peoplehood, and we like to make all sorts of statements about peoplehood, but in our minds, in our ideas, we were either focused on the sub-peoplehood units, our denominations, our communities, our political movements, or on the super, beyond the level of our people, on the universe, on the world, on the true political ideology for man, or moral ideology, or more mundane yet more important things like the best cookbook and so forth. But nothing that went as far as the level of our entire people, or stopped at the level of our entire people. So we said, what would it be like to have like a Thanksgiving dinner where the whole big family comes, including that cousin that you despise, but everyone's there because you have to be, because that's what being a family really is. What if we were to have a book like that, with like left to right, and ultra-Orthodox to ultra-secular, and Americans and Israelis and other diasporas, and to have young influencers combined with sort of veteran power writers, and all of this together. And what binds them all together is that each one is speaking to the entire people. Each one is offering an idea, a priority for our people's future. The book came together much more quickly than I expected. It still took a long time, but it was, we had planned on doing just 30 essays, and it kind of got out of control. And it would have kept going if the publisher hadn't said to me, hold on, 65 is quite enough. Any more than that, we're going to have to raise the price point, and then no one's going to buy it, so that's it. So numbers but we can retroactively find some symbolic significance to the number 65. That's what we Jews do. I haven't done it yet. The funniest thing about this book, though, is that all the essays were done by the end of December of 2022, which means that it was before the whole judicial reform protest exploded. And for the first 9 months of 2023, we were deeply worried that our book would feel out of date, because it doesn't talk about judicial reform and the whole controversy. And then came October 7th. Leave aside the fact that worry disappeared all of a sudden. It was specifically the books that don't talk about judicial reform that suddenly became relevant again. I experienced October 7th like most of you, I assume, most Israelis. A few days of complete, baffling bewilderment at the fact that there were actual terrorists and we had no idea how far they had gotten. After a few days of that, switching over into this sort of full-blown mobilization and war mindset, to see our kids serving, and suddenly called up. Suddenly I had 5 kids in uniform. And it was a hard thing. But as you all experienced it, when you're going through a terrible trauma, one of the best things you can do, and the only things you can do, sometimes is just to focus on putting one foot in front of the next, right? To focus on the most pragmatic details of life. You still have to get up, you still have to get your kids off to school, you still have to buy the groceries. Things still need to happen. And for me, the thing that needed to happen was, am I getting on a plane to America to do a dozen events about this book right now, really? And I was pretty sure that I wasn't. I was pretty sure that this was one of those moments where the book launch gets put off because we have catastrophe before us. And then something weird happened. I got a call first from the folks in Philadelphia at the Weizmann Museum, where an entire full-day event had been planned with 30 speakers. And they said to me, we need this right now. Please come. And if you can get the speakers to come, despite what happened, let's do it, because the Jewish community needs it. And in New York City, at the Stryker Center on the Upper East Side, where we had a 9-speaker event, same thing. We need this right now. Right now, especially. So I didn't know what American Jewry was going through, because I experienced October 7th as an Israeli Jew. But when I got to Philadelphia, and then New York, and then Palo Alto at the Z3 conference, and all the events we did in between, private and public events, what I found was a community beside itself. On the one hand, scared. On the other hand, I heard the word loneliness, which is a word I had not really heard in Israel so much. I found a community that was starting to mobilize, but they were mobilizing beautifully and amazingly to help Israel at a time just as the threat to their community, to the diaspora, was only beginning to emerge on the campuses and on the streets and in communities across the diaspora. A lot of confusion, and much of it I think still remains today. And all along this way, it felt like Jewish priorities and the idea of coming together as a people, not in the things that we agree on, which is important and yet doesn't necessarily hold an entire book, but rather, especially on the things we disagree on. To get together around that table and have what I called an intellectual food fight, because that's what we do. That's us being us, together. So before I'm going to call out these wonderful, wonderful panelists, I just want to say, first of all, tremendous thanks to Paul and to the Begin Center. I also want to say thank you to the folks at the Z3 project in Palo Alto. Z3 is something you're going to hear from me quite a bit moving forward. I just spent a week in Palo Alto. Many of you are maybe unfamiliar with them. They are a project of the Oshman Family JCC, but they have application that goes far, far beyond the Bay Area's community. The Z3 project has an annual conference, which is about sort of rethinking, reimagining Zionism for the 21st century and Israel diaspora relations. And they've also built some incredible networks of JCCs and youth movements and campus organizations and many other things where they're developing the tools for injecting new approaches to Zionism. And they brought me on as a senior fellow, and we're going to be building something really special together with a number of other scholars and thinkers, hoping to help Z3 become really the cornerstone of a new generation of Zionist thinking, both for America and for across the diaspora. So thank you to them also. I don't know if Amitai or Dror or Maya are listening over in Palo Alto, but if you are, thank you. So I want to invite up our speakers for this evening, our panelists. Every single one of them, I personally feel humbled to have them in my book and thrilled that they've agreed to come tonight. The four of them together, really, not just because my voice is going, but because it's just amazing to see them, and I would love to just let them talk. Yossi, Klein, Halevi, come on up. Einat, Neuer, and Izabella Tabarovsky. So is there a chair for me? Is this thing on? All right. So we're going to do basically 2 rounds, and then hopefully our panelists will disagree or agree and still feel the need to throw things at each other. I'll just introduce them all briefly, but you can all feel free to expand on what your things that I don't necessarily know. Izabella is a scholar on the subject of the Soviet influences on modern anti-Semitism. Her essay in Jewish Priorities is on that subject, and it's really kind of amazing. And if you don't tell everything that's amazing, I'll add things so that everybody knows. Your current institutional affiliation, you're at the Cannon Center?
Cannon Institute at the Wilson Center.
Thank you, sorry. Hillel Neuer is the CEO and president of UN Watch in Geneva, which is an organization that I've been following for many, many years since we knew each other way back when he wrote essays on legal issues for Azure, the journal that I edited. On judicial reform. No, we were like in this thing back in like the late 90s, early 2000s, dealing with Orthodox judicial revolution. We knew all about it. And then Hillel became the director of this amazing organization called UN Watch, which, unlike the rest of us who watch the UN and just like leave our mouths open in horror when it comes especially to human rights issues, the Human Rights Council, UNRWA, and the rest, Hillel actually monitors and takes them into account, holds them to account, and calls them out. And since October 7th, many of you know, his work has been just incredible. He testified before Congress last week. Einat Wilf, former member of Knesset, also a long, many years dear friend, also an ex-Azure author. And most recently author of the collection of essays We Are All Zionists, and before that, The War of Return, which is exactly about refugees and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And Yossi Klein Halevi, who probably requires no introduction, and yet... I wrote for Azure. And wrote for Azure. No, the only one who didn't write for Azure is Izabella, and we're still working on it. Yossi wrote, and I know this isn't your most recent book, but the book, Yossi wrote a book many years ago called Memoirs of a Jewish Extremist, which moved me to tears because it was really covering a period a little bit before my time, but being a Jew in New York in sort of the early mid-70s, and dealing with questions of Jewish pride and questions of how to handle the fundamental sort of spiritual problems that American Jews were going through. But then over the course of several books, Yossi really explores the spiritual side of things in many different ways, whether in like Dreamers or Letter to a Palestinian Neighbor. And I would love to know what you're working on now. And he's a senior fellow at the Harvard Institute, I need to mention. All right, maybe when you'll tell us what you're working on. Okay. So what I'm going to do 2 rounds. In the first round, I'm going to ask each of the authors to pretend for a moment that October 7th hadn't happened, because that's the mindset we were in when we all wrote our essays. and to talk a little bit about what you wrote about and why it may be more important now than it was at the time you wrote it. Because I think it's true for all of your essays, that it's actually more important now than it was at the time of writing. Maybe we can begin with Izabella.
Sure, and so first of all, it's wonderful to be here. I feel incredibly honored to be part of this panel, and I want to say that Yossi understood earlier than anybody else what I had to say, and I'm really grateful for that. I think in order to understand, I think, what I write about, and I mostly write about Soviet anti-Zionism and compare it to contemporary anti-Semitism. This is the topic of my essay for the book. Where it all started, it started a few years ago. In 2017 or so, I saw a news item on TV which looked really weird. Today none of us would be surprised to see it. It's all over the place. But in 2017, to me, it looked strange. I saw pictures of young people on an American campus carrying placards that said Zionism is racism and Zionists are Nazis. And it really confused me very deeply. And I called my dad and I told him about it. And I said, Dad, they say that anti-Zion, that they're not being anti-Semitic, they're just being anti-Zionist. And my dad burst out laughing, and he said, well, this we've heard before. And I thought, wow, we have heard this before. Now, who are we? We are Soviet Jews who emigrated from the Soviet Union in 1989, 1990, at a time when all the Jews were leaving the workers' paradise. We became Americans, American values, work hard, get to the best school, and you'll get ahead. And we thought we left the anti-Semitism behind. And it was really not until 2017 that I thought about it for the first time. And I began tracking it, and I realized that there had been a massive, massive international campaign that the Soviet Union conducted, starting with 1967, to demonize Zionism in Israel. It was conducted truly pushing these ideas to the global left and to the developing world. And it was conducted using the same slogans that we're hearing today. Again, Israel is an apartheid state. Israel is a reincarnation of Nazi Germany. Israelis are conducting a genocide. Sounds familiar, right? So all of it, a lot of times people think all of this is new, but all of it is already in Soviet literature as of 1967 onward. And so I started writing about it. And in some ways, it was hard to, and this was the topic of my essay. And my essay revolves around a correspondence. I started looking at, what were the channels to which the Soviets pushed these ideas out. And so I took like a micro view, it's correspondence between the Soviet ambassador to the United States in Washington, D.C., his correspondence with his superiors in Moscow, 1970, 1971. He is writing to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Moscow. America is beset by Zionism. Zionists are everywhere in America. There are these Jews, they are in Congress, they are in, wherever you look, they're in the media, they're in banks, and they're all pro-Israel. And this explains why we can't get anywhere with our Soviet interests. Zionists are against us, and they're right here. And so the ministry writes back to him and says, well, you better get to work. You need to uproot the Zionist influence. So you need to work with progressive Jewish organizations, and you need to create cleavages between them and Zionist Jews, and you need to create cleavages between Zionists and non-Jews in the United States. And he says, yes, of course, I'll work on that. So, we don't know how much influence he specifically made, but it's just a small glimpse into the campaign. And so, this is just to help you understand, the slogans and the motifs and the explanatory logic of contemporary left, of contemporary anti-Israel left, is precisely that. It's like it repeats it to 99%. The only thing so far that I've discovered that doesn't repeat Soviet slogans is from the river to the sea. So they've made one innovation. So I think that it's really crucial to understand this. I really began screaming about this as soon as, for the last several years, I think approximately every article I've written and every speech I've given has been about how dangerous this rhetoric is. And it was very hard to get people to listen to this before October 7th. Why? Because everybody was distracted by the questions of, is anti-Zionism really anti-Semitism or not? Which anti-Semitism is worse, left or right? And so we were all kind of in this, you David, are using the phrase food fight. So we were in this food fight about that. And then October 7th happened, and I don't feel like I need to be convincing people as much anymore, but it's becoming even more relevant because this rhetoric is all over the place. And so my argument to my people is that we need to understand this past, because without it we really can't understand the present. And therefore we can't figure out what to do for the future. I think one of the things, there's several things that become very clear once you understand this history. One is that when a society or institutions adopt anti-Zionism as their policy, anti-Semitism follows inevitably. So the two may not be the same in theory, but in practice they always follow. They're always the same. What's happening today with American Jews, it almost makes me want to cry to see it. It's so eerily similar to what Soviet Jews underwent in 1970s and 80s. So this gradual disappearance from public square, the closure of certain spaces, of academic spaces, of certain professions, the gradual reduction of ways in which you can express your Jewish identity, it's all happening now. And I have to say, I did write about it. It was just hard for people to hear and to understand, and now people see it and hear it. And I'll conclude on this, another point I think that becomes clear when you understand this history is that we are not dealing with slogans that were invented by some idealists in Berkeley, California, okay? We are dealing with a really sophisticated set of ideas. The entirety of the Soviet apparatus was brought together to produce it, right? It was produced by the KGB and the Central Committee of the Communist Party. But they had the resources of the entire state in their hands, financial resources, academic resources, think tankers, media, right? So when people ask me, well, give me 3 points, give me an elevator speech. If I'm with an Israel hater in an elevator, and we go from the first floor to 14th floor, how can I convince him in these 10 seconds, to not be an Israel hater? It's not going to work this way. We're dealing with a sophisticated set of ideas. We need to take it seriously. Better PR is not going to help us. So, I'll finish here.
Thank you, Izabella. I heard Izabella give a talk at the City University of New York a couple months ago where she presented a slide that had the actual pamphlets that the Soviets produced in millions of copies in English and distributed across North American campuses with titles like Zionism is colonialism, Israel is apartheid. Just all the actual slogans that we're used to hearing were sprinkled and disseminated as a deliberate Cold War strategy by the Soviet Union. And the kids who read those pamphlets are today the professors and the esteemed emeriti and all of these award-winning scholars are the same people who were directly influenced. It's not just a parallel, there's a causal relationship, or to put it another way, we're the only people left on Earth who are still fighting the Cold War. From anti-Semitism, we shift to something that is more universal, which is the struggle for human rights, what we call the International Human Rights Movement, which is something that Hillel has been studying for many years in his capacity as a watchdog of the UN's efforts to promote human rights, or to pretend to promote human rights in the world. Hillel, why don't you talk a little bit about the essay you wrote, because to me it was very powerful as well, especially because of its historical perspective.
Sure. Thank you, David, and delighted to be here and honored to be with this August panel. I think it's good to have the segue to talk about Soviet anti-Zionism to talk about the United Nations, because that had a tremendous impact on the UN, and I've benefited from your very important writings. You know, one of the important books that I read when I joined UN Watch 20 years ago next month was A Dangerous Place by Patrick Moynihan, which is a brilliant memoir about his time as ambassador in New York to the United Nations for less than a year when the Zionism as Racism resolution was infamously adopted in December 1975. And there were two famous speeches. Israelis may know that of, at the time, Ambassador Klein, who tore up the resolution in two, like his father had done here in Jerusalem when the white paper was adopted, I think in front of Yeshua synagogue here in Jerusalem. He tore up the white paper. So that was Chaim Herzog tore it up and gave a brilliant speech, but Ambassador Moynihan gave a brilliant speech as well, helped in part by Norman Podhoretz and others who were helping him for a few days before. Yeah. So in his book, he's very mindful of the role of the Soviet Union in pushing the Zionism as Racism resolution, which has poisoned the UN and our discourse, and led us down to, that was 1975. It was repealed in 91 when the Soviet Union fell, but then it was revived with Durban in 2001, and then the large human rights groups like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, about 2 or 3 years ago, which came up with their 200-page reports or 300-page reports accusing Israel of being an apartheid state, which has tremendous impact on the young people today. Immediately after October 7th, when they ran on campuses and saying Israel is evil, one of the major influences was leading human rights groups of the world publishing these reports saying Israel is apartheid with hundreds of footnotes. It's all nonsense, it's all a lie. But that had the impact. And there's this UN special rapporteur on Palestine, and her name is Francesca Albanese. She's anti-Semitic. She said 10 years ago on Facebook, she used to work for UNRWA, surprise, surprise. She's an Italian lawyer, she worked for UNRWA, and she wrote 10 years ago, she was trying to fundraise on her Facebook page. She said, the Jewish lobby controls America. America is subjugated by the Jewish lobby, and Europe is subjugated by Holocaust guilt. So this is Francesca Albanese. She also says the Nakba, the Palestinian suffering of 1948, 49, which they call the Nakba, the catastrophe, that's like the Holocaust. So, and a week or two ago, she said that Jews have something epigenetic about genocide. So, they suffered the Holocaust, so of course they're perpetrating it. And of course, our friend Dr. Shani Moore wrote a brilliant essay about people like her were waiting for the genocide charge. She was already hinting, about 6 months ago, she already hinted that she was coming out with that accusation a year ago, before October 7th. So they're just waiting for this. So Francesca Albanese, she said a year or two ago in an interview, and I'm forgetting the Italian, but she said, these two groups, Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, came out with these reports saying that this was apartheid, and she says, the Italians will forgive me, something like, hanno liberato la parola. She said, they liberated the word. And she looks heavenwards, they liberated the word. She's so thrilled and ecstatic that the word that she's trying to say, that she gets in trouble. She says, I get in trouble when I compare the Nakba to the Holocaust, but now she can say apartheid as the UN rapporteur, and that's easy. And she was leading the UN experts in signing statements the past several months accusing Israel of genocide. And the ICJ ruling, if I don't know if it's actually a ruling or an opinion, exactly what it was, but the statement that they delivered recently, the order cites this joint statement by UN rapporteurs. These are being led by Francesca Albanese. So anyway, the Soviet Union had a very pernicious effect with the Zionism as racism lie cooked up in the Soviet Union and brought over to the UN. So let me say a few words. People here mostly know me for my work at UN Watch fighting anti-Israel bias, which unfortunately keeps us rather busy. And the past 6 months, since October 7th, past 5 months have been horrible. Things that the Secretary General has said, like it didn't happen in a vacuum. I'm not justifying, but it didn't happen in a vacuum, and then he justified. And the silence of UN women, and the UNRWA members being terrorists, which is the least of the problems of UNRWA. Maybe Einat will tell us about it. So people will know our work on that, which keeps us rather busy at UN Watch. People less know that our universal mandate to hold the UN accountable, but to promote human rights. So for the past 15 years, we organized the annual Geneva Summit for Human Rights and Democracy. And I want to acknowledge the presence here of two of my colleagues, Dan Smith, where's Dan? Dan Smith and Dina Rofer are legal advisor, and Dan Smith are director of advocacy. So they work with me, and one of the things we do is the annual Geneva Summit for Human Rights, and we bring together the most courageous men and women from around the world, including my good friend Vladimir Kara-Murza, who's in a Siberian penal colony because he went back to Moscow. His family's in Washington, but he went back to Moscow and he said Putin's a war criminal for what he's doing in Ukraine. He said it on CNN, and a few hours later, I believe it was April 11th, 2 years ago, they came and took him away, and he's been sentenced to 25 years in prison and is suffering horribly. And I'm trying to work with his wife, Evgenia, who's sort of like the modern day Avital Sharansky, going around the world trying to free her husband. So we bring these people. He was poisoned twice, but we brought him after the poisoning to Geneva to speak at the United Nations, and we do the same with Yang Jianli, Chinese political prisoner, and Cuban political prisoners like Rosa Maria Payá, one of the leading dissidents, and Venezuelans. And we work with these heroes of the human rights movement, and we confront dictatorships, and we give a platform that typically the UN does not give them. The UN, on the contrary, elects the dictatorships to sit on the Human Rights Council, which today includes Cuba, Qatar, China, and another 60% of the council are either dictatorships or non-democracies. So I'm working in the center of the human rights movement in Geneva at the United Nations Human Rights Council, and I walk in there a lot, and I walk past René Cassin Square, right? So you can't avoid, if you're a little bit mindful of history, you can't avoid thinking about history. So I walk through René Cassin Square. René Cassin is the French Jewish legal philosopher who was with Charles de Gaulle in World War II. He escaped with de Gaulle to London. And he is considered one of the architects of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, won the Nobel Prize. So I think of him, and I think of Eleanor Roosevelt. People know some of my speeches about her. She was the founding chair of the Human Rights Commission and a great Zionist. She was the honorary chair of Hadassah Youth Aliyah and came to Israel all the time. And when she died, Israel apparently had a rule not to make postage stamps in honor of her person, but they broke the rule for her because she was such a tremendous friend of Zionism in Israel. And she spoke out in the early 60s when the UN began to condemn Israel. So I'm mindful of who these figures were. And our founder, whom I never met, Morris Abram, is one of the great civil rights leaders. You know, of the black civil rights leaders, when they would invite them to the White House, there'd be one white guy with Martin Luther King and the others, and that was Morris Abram. So he was, in the early years, in the 1950s, before it was fashionable at all, he was a leading civil rights leader and a Jewish leader. And I think he was, where's William? Yeah, so if I'm not mistaken, I think he was head of the Conference of Presidents. I think Malcolm worked with him, Conference of Presidents of organization. So he was a tremendous Jewish leader and a human rights figure, and he founded UN Watch in Geneva. So I'm sitting there at the human rights movement, I'm working with these human rights heroes, and when I walk into the room, actually many of the leading organizations treat me as contaminated. They will literally sometimes cross the street to avoid being seen next to me. And I'm talking about Amnesty International, which about 6 years ago canceled an event. The British people here may remember it. It was reported in Haaretz and The Guardian. I was supposed to speak in London, the Jewish Leadership Council, I think it's called, which is about approximately 30 Jewish community groups in London. They invited me for an event, and a few days before, it was supposed to be at the Amnesty International Conference Center. They canceled it for no good reason. They said we supported settlements. We don't talk about the settlements. Neither does the Jewish Leadership Council in London talk about settlements. So they just were totally anti-Israel, and I would say anti-Semitic. So Amnesty International, the folks at Human Rights Watch, and the other leading groups hate us. And they hate us for two reasons. They hate UN Watch because, number one, because we speak out against anti-Israel bias and we defend the right of Israel to exist. And they hate us for that. Because of their speeches, if you hear the Iranian regime speaking and you hear Amnesty International, if you didn't hear the accent, if you read the text, it would be almost you would not be able to distinguish what is an Iranian regime speech about Israeli apartheid and an Amnesty International speech. They're about identical. And they hate us because of our views on Israel, but they hate us even more because we care about human rights. Because actually Jews who are proud Jews are allowed to also care about universal human rights, about what happens in Russia, in China, in Cuba, in Zimbabwe, in Pakistan. And we're doing work that many of them don't do. We do, creative work to give them a platform, to put them on TV, to confront their oppressor at the UN. And many of these groups turn to us. We have, Venezuelans, North Koreans, Cubans, who are calling me, and we're a small group, they should go to Amnesty. So they hate us even more because we're in the human rights space. And so my essay tackles this this odd situation where the founders of human rights at the United Nations were actually not only many of them Jews, but actually proud Jews, not the ashamed Jews in America who are in many in the human rights groups. People like Ken Roth, who could be, was it Howard Jacobson wrote the book? I forget what the book is called. Someone will remind me. Talk about the Ashamed Jews Society. Anyway, so the founders of human rights and the international scene were people like Raphael Lemkin. We're talking about genocide. He would be turning in his grave to see that the term that he coined in 1948, he worked himself to death. He was a Polish Jewish lawyer whose family were massacred in the Holocaust, and he coined the concept and the term genocide and got the United Nations to adopt the Genocide Convention in 1948. And so too Hirsch Lauderpacht, who was towering international law human rights figure, wrote the International Bill of Rights, which inspired the Universal Declaration. One of the towering figures of human rights and international law was a founder of the World Union of Jewish Students, and we have the president here today, Yana Naftalieva. So he was the founder of that movement, and he was a big Zionist. He was married to a Sabra. He helped, I think it was his niece's husband was Abba Iman. He helped contribute to the Israeli Declaration of Independence. A lot of this isn't written, but many of the key figures, Raphael Lemkin, Lauderpacht, René Cassin, who was a defender of Israel during the Six-Day War, Eleanor Roosevelt, tremendous Zionist, our founder, Morris Abram, many of the leading human rights figures were not just universal ashamed Jews, but were proud Jews. And today, fast forward, you have people like Ken Roth, who led Human Rights Watch up until recently, and is virulently anti-Israel. He really has a hatred that is pathological, and I followed him on Twitter for a long time, since Twitter began, and I can tell you that there are some people who wake up in the morning and say, how can I turn the knife against Israel and Jews who support Israel? And that's it. There are others who do it because it's the thing to do, and there are a few people who really, they're pathological about it. That's Ken Roth, who's Jewish, and people I mentioned in my essay, Richard Falk, who was on the board of Amnesty International around the time when he wrote his 1979 essay in the op-ed in the New York Times, Trusting Khomeini. So when Ayatollah Khomeini came to power, he wrote an op-ed saying, trust Khomeini, he has a new vision of democracy, you should trust him, it's going to be really good. He went on to serve on the board of Human Rights Watch, was a UN expert, and we confronted him and got him condemned for his 9/11 conspiracy remarks and other things. So in a nutshell, for me, I'm working with human rights heroes. They come to Geneva, they come to the international community, and in many cases, the center of gravity is dominated by these fantastically wealthy organizations like Amnesty, Human Rights Watch. Last time I checked, had $220 million in the bank. George Soros had given them a $100 million gift over 10 years. And they dominate the human rights movement, and there are good people who suffered from communist regimes in Cuba, in Soviet Union, in China, who don't actually want to go to the radical left, and who are looking for something else, but it's kind of absent. And I think there's an opportunity that there are many good people in the world who care about human rights, but don't necessarily want to follow the radical left, but that's all there is. And so my proposal is that just like there's a George Soros who was willing to give $100 million to support groups that demonize Israel and that hijack human rights, couldn't there be the mirror figure? And indeed there are people, Bill Ackman, who emerged after October 7th as a billionaire who's willing to, he said, I'm ashamed that I gave money to Human Rights Watch, and now he feels differently. So my proposal was, would there be someone of serious means, or more than one person, who would be willing to invest in building not just UN Watch, but groups like my mentor, Professor Erwin Kotler, the Raoul Wallenberg Center. There's a group in New York called Human Rights Foundation, which puts out the Oslo Freedom Forum. These are tremendous human rights organizations that are not anti-Israel. And I think there's a moment, and October 7th only reinforces that, the need that the principles of human rights are valid and good, but we need to invest in making sure that the groups that seek to hijack it don't dominate. Thank you.
To see how when we shift from anti-Semitism and the core Soviet origins of it, and human rights, which started out as essentially a Jewish movement, that in both cases it's almost as if the Jew is the litmus test, right? For these things happening in the world, that if they can't handle us, then they're never going to be able to be honest to their own core fundamental values. Before we turn to Einat Wilf, I just want to acknowledge in the audience we have 3 additional contributors to the Jewish Priorities volume, and if it's more than 3, please tell me, because I'm embarrassed by the mistake. We have William Daroff, the President and CEO of the Conference of Presidents. Hillel Silverman, thank you, and Blake Flayton. Thank you very much. So we talked about the people who hate us. We talked about more people who hate us, but in the context of this is they hate us just because of our particular, and they hate us because of our universal. But Einat, you actually wrote an essay that's much more inward about sort of what it was like to teach early Zionist thought to a group of college students at Georgetown University. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that and how it connects to everything, especially post-October 7th.
Certainly, and it's a real pleasure and honor and wonderful project. So, So 3 years ago, I was a visiting professor at Georgetown, and one of the courses that I taught was called Zionism and Anti-Zionism. It was a seminar, and at the end of the course, one of my Jewish students comes up to me and she says, "This course was more valuable to me than dozens of hours of therapy." And I remember that kind of started me on a journey to first figure out why did you feel the need for therapy and why did the course offer it. And what I realized, and also in many conversations with her and other students, is that the rise of anti-Zionism on campus takes an emotional toll because the dynamic by which it operates is a dynamic of bullying. I coined the idea, the reversal of Shakespeare, that it's not the Jews who demand the pound of flesh, but rather the Jews who are demanded to hand over the pound of flesh, mostly metaphorical, sometimes real. And the idea is that Jews are demanded to mutilate their Jewish identity as the price of acceptance. And anti-Zionism basically operates with this dynamic. It demands a pound of flesh of Jews in order to be accepted. And maybe in parentheses before, for many years I struggled with why I emotionally don't seem to be that concerned with the anti-Semitism of the right, the KKK, even though it was lethal. People went and murdered Jews in the name of this kind of KKK-type anti-Semitism, and somehow it troubled me less than the rise of anti-Zionism in the left. And then at one point I realized that anti-Semitism is more akin to crime. We can all be victims of crime. We know that crime exists. We take precautions not to be victims. Sometimes it fails. But by and large, we think of crime as an external threat to our lives, and I will guess that most of you don't hang out with criminals as your immediate social circle. Anti-Zionism operates more like domestic violence. It assaults you in the place where you're supposed to feel safe, the place where you thought of as your home. And if you look at where anti-Zionism rises, it is where Jews actually are. When KKK anti-Semites want to kill Jews, they actually have to go somewhere, right? They have to go to a synagogue to shoot. Anti-Zionists assault Jews where Jews are, where they have considered it their homes. In some cases, like you talked about human rights, they literally built those homes. Social justice circles, human rights organizations, media, universities, and that's where the assault happens. And that's why it takes emotional toll. So the bullying dynamic works like this. As the price of acceptance, you are required to say that you hate Bibi. Fine, that's easy. Fine, I hate Bibi. But then you have to say that Israel's apartheid. Because the bullies, you know, when you give the bully your lunch money, they don't go away, right? They come back the next day and they want more. So now you have to say that Israel's apartheid, but then that's not good enough. And then it escalates, and unless you say that Israel's committing genocide, you know, by now apartheid is all, you know, that's passé. Who cares about that now? Genocide. At one point I talked about it like organizations. When I was in America in the 90s, I was active with like pro-APAC and the two-state solution. That was great. And then J Street came on the scene, and then there was J Street U, and then If Not Now, and then Jewish Voices for Peace. And now, if you're not the Jewish militant co-chair of Students for Justice in Palestine, you're just not a good enough Jew. And that's the process, and it becomes these like exorcism ceremonies where you constantly have to say amen to everything that is demanded of you. And this takes an emotional toll. Because bullying, domestic violence take an emotional toll. And this is what students in universities are subject to. And when this student was studying Zionism and anti-Zionism, one of the things that I did in the course is that we didn't study about Zionism, we didn't study about anti-Zionism, we read the original texts of Zionists and anti-Zionists. And what happens when you engage directly with the texts is something magical. When you read what the Zionists themselves said, all the like Zionism is racism, Zionism is colonial, all of that just melts away. You see a bunch of Jews struggling to figure out how to face modernity, how to deal with the massive dislocation and changes that is modernity. And they try communism and Buddhism and assimilation and Zionism, which is one of many ideas. But you really begin to see it in the context of Jews just trying to figure out how to be Jewish and live in modernity. And when you read the anti-Zionist texts directly, any notion that this is just an innocent idea also fades away. And the sinister undertones really emerge. So for this student, this was a therapeutic process because also what emerged is that Zionism itself was designed as a therapeutic ideal. Zionism was supposed to heal the Jewish condition. The main insight of Zionism was that powerlessness corrupts no less than power. Every civilization knows that power corrupts. You'll read Chinese and Hindu and Roman texts, and they will all tell you that power corrupts. But only the Jews, as both illiterate and a powerless people, could notice that powerlessness corrupts. The need to ingratiate yourself with those who control your life. It corrupts your soul. And Zionism was intended to heal that. So for the students to understand that the bullying they're facing, that the anti-Zionism, that the exorcism ceremonies, that the pound of flesh, were actually had ancient roots. In the essay I quote Tom Holland saying that the idea of universalizing the Jew goes all the way back to Paul. The idea that you want Jews to ultimately not be Jews, to shed anything particular until they can be meshed into the greater idea. The beauty of Tom Holland is that you really understand human rights as a secularized form of Christianity. That the claim that they are universal is the most Christian claim you can make. And that therefore, baked into the idea of the human rights is ultimately the desire to see the particular Jew disappear. So once the students were able to see that their particular kind of misery, difficulty, pressure has a long history, and that Zionism was actually the therapeutic answer to that, well, they emerged with the answer that closes my essay. that the only response to anti-Zionism has really been already formulated, and it's called Zionism.
So we've gone from looking at them to looking at them as a replacement for us to looking at us as a way of responding to them. When I asked you, Yossi, to participate in Jewish Priorities, I said, what would you like to write about? And Yossi said, I want to write about God. And I said, wow, I don't think there's anybody, first of all, none of the other writers have offered to write about God. But more importantly, I don't think there's anybody that I'm more interested in hearing talk about God than you. So this is, and lest any of you think this is somehow off the pattern, it's actually a natural progression, I think, going from talking about them to talking about them, us and them, to talking about them, but really us. And now we're going deep, deep to us alone, I think.
Well, David, I was wondering how you were going to manage that segue. That was really impressive. But first of all, Mazal Tov, it's a beautiful project, and you've given the Jewish people a gift. So thank you. And really honored to be with the three of you. You guys are out there defending the integrity of the Jewish story in so many courageous ways, so thank you. Yeah, and now for something a little different. The proposal of my essay is to create an institution that would be a new kind of Jewish center for study. I wouldn't even call it a yeshiva. Something that I think might have once existed in ancient Israel. A center where spiritual seekers, in those days they called them prophets, would come to study the techniques of encountering the divine. And the late Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan wrote a very important book called Meditation in the Bible, in which he lays out the linguistic clues that we missed in Tanakh about what actually happened in what the Torah calls the schools of the prophets. And so here we are back in the land, and the idea of this proposal is that we need to reconfigure how we understand Jewish study, because what we've done is import the model of exile, the yeshiva of exile, for the last 2,000 years, and centered study around Talmud. And I think that it's time to reconfigure and to think about the centrality of God in Jewish life. Now, the last 2 centuries have not been kind to God, generally, and in Judaism in particular. We've gone through waves of experiences, collective experiences, that undermined the centrality of God in Jewish life, beginning with secularism in the 19th century, Zionism, the mass upheavals and mass migrations of Jews around the world. 90% of Jews today live in countries that are different from their great-grandparents. And so we've all experienced the assault of the Soviet Union against God, against Jewish identity, but especially Judaism. And so we've experienced multiple waves of assault against the centrality of God. And my understanding of the Jewish story, and of course there are lots of different ways to read the Jewish story, is that it is the story of a tumultuous love affair between a people and God. Not always a happy love affair. There are times when God accuses the Jews of faithfulness. There are times when the Jews accuse God of faithlessness. But for the better part of 3,500 years, that story defined who we were. And in that sense, the last 200 years are something of an anomaly. And yet if you look at Jewish life today, we're about so many interesting, important issues, Zionism, Tikkun Olam, Talmudic study, halachic observance, and none of those are really about trying to know God. Even halakha and even Torah study, it's about serving God, and that's a crucial part of the spiritual life. But what we've lost in the last few hundred years is, and the last real movement to embody this was early Hasidism, is that the search for knowing God, the conceit that a human being can actually bridge the abyss between our mortal lives and the eternal, is in fact central to how Judaism evolved for millennia. And the notion that we can be a whole or intact Jewish people and somehow live around this idea that there are some people within Judaism who are committed to trying to know God, or at least to see whether that's possible, whether millennia of testimonies by mystics in all the religions, all the great religions, that it is possible to know God, is true or not. And a religion is defined by those of its people who are committed to the task of trying to make God real in their lives and in the lives of the people. And in a way, it's strange for me to be speaking about this publicly because this has been a crucial part of my inner life for the last 40 plus years since moving to Israel. And in my public Jewish life, I speak about the issues that we're all speaking about. And I'm much more comfortable in this conversation publicly. And because there's something about the quest for God that is private, not secret, but for it to have integrity, it needs to be private and not necessarily paraded on stage. But I felt the need to write this essay for exactly the reason that you noted, which was that I thought it was a fair assumption that no one else would be writing about God in a book about Jewish priorities. And so I felt, by default, somebody had to do it. And you're just going to have to stop me at some point, because once I start going on this, it's hard to, we're speaking about the eternal, the boundless, it's hard to put a boundary on talk about God. But there are two reasons, I would say, for why I feel we need I call it a kind of a Jewish ashram, for want of a better term. We need a Jewish term for this. And the very fact that we don't have a Jewish term for even conceiving what this kind of institution would be shows how deeply the search for an intimate relationship with God has been displaced from our consciousness. And so I have two motives for proposing this institution. The first is practical, and the second is conceptual. Practically, there are tens of thousands, maybe more, maybe hundreds of thousands, of Jews who, beginning in my generation, in the 1960s and 70s, began turning east. And when I began getting interested in God, I didn't feel I had anywhere in Judaism to go, and I tried. I thought at one point of becoming Haredi, and it didn't work. And so I got interested in the East, where they're really, in Hinduism in particular, where the God quest is central, and where the notion of an ashram is natural to life in the East. And we have lost, really, I think, hundreds of thousands of some of our best spiritual seekers, because there's no place for them in Judaism. If you're a serious seeker of God, you basically have Breslev. Now, I love Breslev, but I can take Breslev in limited doses. And if you're not prepared to buy the whole package of Breslev, where do you go really? Chabad once, but I think Chabad has moved really in a different direction. And so there really is there's no real address in Judaism for a spiritual seeker who wants to immerse in God consciousness. And so that's the practical reason, is to figure out how do we begin speaking to a lost generation. And I once heard Rabbi Shlomo Kalmach say something that really stayed with me. He said that a guru once, and I don't know if this is a real story or not, you never knew it was, but he said that, a guru once said to him, "You Jews, you're the most spiritual people in the world." And so Shlomo said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "My ashram is full of Jews." And he said, "Every ashram I go to, they're all Jews." And that's a wonderful story and a tragic story. So that's the practical point of this. And the conceptual is that there are really two ways of being a religious person, two ways in which religion impacts on a person. The first is, let's say, the more conventional approach, which is that religion reassures a human being who is stranded in this terrifying and alien universe, that it gives you a home, it gives you a community, it gives you strength, rituals that are passed down from generation to generation. It makes this strange universe familiar. That's one very important role of religion. But there's another opposite role of religion, which is the mystical path. And the mystical path is to confront the strangeness of existence and to open yourself, to leave yourself naked before the unfathomable, and to see whether there's something in us that is divine. And the Torah tells us we're created in the divine image. One can understand that in different ways. Jewish mystics understood it literally. We are imprinted with aspects of divinity. And the way of the mystic is to encounter the universe without that sense of comforting familiarity. And both of those are Jewish approaches. And the last point I'll say about that is that can really be framed in two very strong Jewish languages, two very strong Jewish words. The first is hamavdil, and the second is echad. Hamavdil is the world of separated consciousness, which is our ordinary world. And hamavdil is that part of Judaism that deals with distinctions. Ben Yisrael la'amin, ben choshech la'or, and that's deeply a part of everyday Judaism. But echad is actually the goal of Judaism, to the revelation of the oneness that is concealed in multiplicity. And it is the search for echad that drives the mystic. And there have been place in Judaism and the Jewish people for thousands of years for the search for echad. And I feel that one of the reasons why we are so lost today as a people is that we've abandoned the search for echad and the centrality of echad in Judaism. And so that's the modest or not so modest proposal.
Before we open up the questions, I'm going to do a lightning round. I'm going to ask each of you in no more than one sentence, preferably less, because I know how long your sentences can get, to tell me what are you most afraid of moving forward, looking into the future right now. What are you most afraid of, and what are you most hopeful about? Fear, hope. Okay, we're going to go in reverse order, starting with you, Yossi.
I hate that. I'm most afraid of the fringes of Jewish life, the extremes of Jewish life becoming mainstream. I'm most afraid in Israel of the far right. And I'm most afraid in American Jewry of the far left. Hopeful of what we saw happening in Israel from October 6th to October 8th. How the mainstream reconstituted itself after the worst year in Israel's history. We went from the worst year to the worst day, but I think that we've now proven that we still have the intuition of peoplehood. And I really fear that we were losing it over the last year. And so I'm hopeful that even when we go back, inevitably, to the fights of pre-October 7th, and I'm prepared to go back to that fight, but that we're going to do it, hopefully, in a different way.
So related to that, my greatest fear is that we will miss the moment of after October 7th for transformation and positive transformation. And my hope is that we will not miss this moment. That's basically it.
My fear over the past few months has been just the very physical fear. My hometown is Montreal. I've got some good friends here from Montreal. We've had violence there, Molotov cocktails, and shooting at schools, Jewish schools. So there's been a very real physical fear, and everyone who lives in the diaspora has felt that, as people in Israel obviously feel it as well. That is a real fear. So the anti-Semitism is more raw and more real than we've ever seen it, and it's scary. We're all scared. And the hope is, the October 8th Jews. I mentioned one, Bill Ackman. I'm not an expert on him, but he's someone who was giving money to Human Rights Watch, which was demonizing Israel. I don't think he really knew that, but he said, I'm ashamed of that, and now he stood up and uses his tremendous platform to fight against anti-Semitism at Harvard and other places. So he gives me hope. Danielle Haas is someone who worked at Human Rights Watch for 12 years as an editor. She wrote this public letter calling out Human Rights Watch for their anti-Semitism. And I've met people in America, in Florida, someone who's Israeli, who never was involved in Jewish issues, and now she's totally mobilized trying to help the movie-making world, defend Israel's image and stuff like that. So these people who have returned to being proud Jews and standing up, that gives me hope.
I think my greatest fear is that we will forget that sense of unity that I think so many of us had after October 7th, and where there was a feeling that the separations are gone and that we are more open to, we understand each other much more, and more conversation is able to happen. My greatest hope, I would say, is actually the young Israelis. I'm new in Israel, relatively speaking. I've been living here for 4 years. When I see what Israelis are doing, how they've stood up to defend the country, it's such a sharp contrast, I think, to what we see in the United States. It's the young people who have a sense of purpose, who understand something so deep and so important, and I have a lot of hope connected to that.
I hadn't planned on answering my own question. Fair enough, fair enough. My greatest fear is that we will revert to our old habits once the crisis is past. I think that we are living in a time where obviously Israelis have been shown a tremendous, we call it an intelligence failure, that there was something very rotten in the systems that were protecting us. I think the same is true for the diaspora, though they haven't said it as explicitly. That all the defense organizations, that American diaspora Jews woke up to discovering that they had been wrong about fundamental issues of their own strategy of survival. And there is a tremendous need for rethinking around the Jewish world. And that if people don't take advantage of that moment and fundamentally invest in the ideas development side of things and the ideas battle the way the Soviets did against us, then we're simply going to revert back to old habits. My hope, similar to what Izabella said, my hope comes from my kids. My hope comes from talking to young Israelis, many of whom have seen battle and have served, and who didn't necessarily, and even if not in the IDF, but who mobilized, and the incredible passion and determination and coherence of purpose that I think has inspired the great majority of Israeli grown-ups. And my hope is that that inspiration will go far beyond the borders of Israel, and that Jews around the world will take inspiration from young Israelis to pull together and to focus their energies and to fight the battles that are going to be hard and are going to keep coming for a long time. Neuer and Yossi Klein. Halevi, we're going to go to questions and answers with Paul's help.
Okay, can I take one of the cordless mics? Okay, so wait for the mic to get to you. I'm going to give it in time-honored fashion. Please make your question a question with a question mark at the end. And not just a statement that sort of inflects slightly up, just action. Yes, gentleman there with the Moshe, with the beard.
Okay?
Yeah.
Okay. I want to get back to the book, if I could. My name is Moshe Dan, by the way. When I saw the advertisement for your book, I asked myself, what are my Jewish priorities? I think that's where I wanted to ask you. Something I wrote about today, which was published today, in the Arutz Sheva website. Jewish sovereignty, is that a Jewish priority? The reason I ask that question is because I think we need to have that kind of discussion, and we're not. And this is really the foundation.
Moshe, can I ask, just to clarify, do you mean something more than just, because we talked about Zionism, something more than Zionism meaning Jewish sovereignty?
Is Jewish sovereignty a Jewish priority? It's a simple question. Jewish sovereignty.
Okay. So, whoever wants to say.
Thank you, Moshe. Is Jewish sovereignty a Jewish priority? I personally think it is. I confess that we could have easily had an essay in the volume that we don't have about Jewish sovereignty, particularly sovereignty, not just Zionism, from a therapeutic perspective, but very, very specifically on the notion of is there such a thing as Jewish sovereignty beyond simply the Jews having a state of their own? And is there a religious element to sovereignty? These are powerful, powerful questions, which I hope to address in a future volume. I will take the moment. Can I plug the future volume?
Go.
Okay. We will be publishing a new volume, hopefully by the end of this year, called Young Zionist Voices. This will focus entirely on younger authors. It'll be paperback. We'll have events with younger people who are younger. More to come.
Okay. Yes. Let's stay this side just for now. And yes, Halevi.
Hi.
A younger voice, by the way.
Hi, my name is Wilf, and my question is specifically for Yossi, Klein, Halevi, and Wilf, and it has to do with peace and living the future with the Palestinians. So Yossi, Klein, Halevi, as your book, you wrote the book Letters to Our Palestinian Neighbors, and they wrote you back. And in Einat, Wilf, you're a member of parliament, you spoke about what a Jewish state is. So, what is the solution? And based on, and I guess specifically for Yossi, Klein, Halevi, based on what you read, the responses, how can we live in peace with our Palestinian neighbors? And in Einat, Wilf, what is a Jewish state? How can we define a Jewish state for the 20% of the people in the Jewish state who aren't Jewish? Like, what can it mean to them?
Yossi, you tried to avoid discussing this for one by talking about God, but it didn't work.
Yeah, well, I thought that God was a difficult topic. Look, post-October 7th, Noah, even people like me who in principle support a two-state solution, are not there right now. And I'm not speaking ideologically, I'm speaking emotionally. And because of that book, I've had journalists approach me since October 7th asking, so what's the vision? And my response is that I'm frozen right now. It's still October 7th, and when someone is in mourning, you don't ask about, how are you going to spend the money from the will? And practical questions come a little later. But what I will say is that the morning after this war, nobody's going away. Not us, not them. We're all going to wake up into the same ruins. And the solution, it seems to me, is to first of all stop speaking about peace and speak about arrangements. It's not going to be peace, maybe not in our lifetime, but we are going to have to figure out arrangements. Now there are two takeaways from October 7th. The first takeaway, two takeaways about a Palestinian state. The first takeaway is you've got to be out of your mind. I live in French Hill, the last row of houses, literally the end of Jerusalem, and on the next hill is already the territories begin, Palestinian villages on the next hill. The thought of importing the Otef, the Gaza border, to French Hill seems to be madness post-October 7th. There's another takeaway from October 7th, which is the opposite, which is that Ariel Sharon was right. And these two peoples cannot live together between the river and the sea. We cannot live in one big dysfunctional state. October 7th proved that we need separation. And this brings me back to something I think Einat, this might resonate for you. The early years of the Oslo process, there were two camps that supported Oslo. There was Shimon Peres, who spoke about peace, and there was Rabin, who spoke about separation. Rabbi never spoke about peace. And he said these two peoples cannot live together. So I think that for Biden to be speaking to us now about a two-state solution is ludicrous. But sooner or later, we're going to have to look at the map again.
Sorry. So this is related actually also to the previous question, because this is the core of everything. The Jewish sovereignty. This is the conflict. The conflict, once you go into it, has never been about occupation or settlement or all those things. It was fundamentally about a very simple question. Can those around us accept Jewish sovereignty in their midst? That has always been the conflict. Everything else is details. And this is precisely the battle that has been taking place. Sometimes I call the conflict a century-long battle of exhaustion. They're trying to exhaust us to give up on the idea of Jewish sovereignty, because Jewish sovereignty is a theological challenge and a sociological challenge to the idea that the only kind of acceptable Jew is meek, powerless, defenseless. And Zionism challenges that, and that's a challenge that never goes over without violence. And so that was the battle. People say, what was Sinwar thinking? Didn't he know that the might of the IDF will be on him? He knew what he was doing. The attack was during the Jewish calendar, so you Jews will not be able to live according to the Jewish calendar, standing down your army according to Jewish rituals and Jewish holidays. And I will make sure that you are defenseless. They first take out the defenders of the kibbutzim, and then you will be sent back to the shtetl. You will be defenseless, you will be butchered, and you will see that a century of building Jewish sovereignty were useless. Because the only kind of Jews that we will accept here are the ones that we decide if they live and die, not you. And around the world, Jews will be endangered by the Jewish sovereignty. And the Jews will begin to think that they are better off without a Jewish sovereignty. That is the battle, and we're still in the midst of it. And I can't say that they're losing. We are in the midst of the battle. And they are the Jews that are answering a question, which is Jewish sovereignty is not a priority. If sovereignty endangers Jews, and this is what the purpose of the attack of October 7th was, then we don't want it. And this is a deep question that I'm sure a lot of us were fearful to admit. And I have colleagues who are saying, if a Jewish state will require endless and escalating violence, not worth it. Because that's exactly how the battle of exhaustion is working, to get us to give up on this massive theological challenge that Jews can be upright, equal, sovereign, in charge of their own fate. And what are we trying to get them to be exhausted by? To just let us be. I was recently in LA and I gave a talk, and one of the people from the movie industry comes up to me and he says, look, they have great slogans. Intifada revolution, from the river to the sea, very exciting. We just sit there on Yisrael High, it's like, I got a slogan for us. I was like, sure. He says, leave us alone. And I thought it was pretty good. Because it's actually what we want, right? Just leave us alone. The whole idea, give them the territory, get out of Gaza, and underneath it all was just leave us alone. We just want to, we just want to be the Jewish state. I have this talk of what is a Jewish state? And I end 3,000 years of Judaism by saying that the Jewish state is the one state in the world where we get to argue about what is the Jewish state. And this is why during judicial reform I was never for a single moment concerned for our democracy, because Israel's a democracy because it's Jewish, not in spite of Jewish. We rest on the Jewish argumentative tradition. Jews will not have a dictatorship. Whatever they're going to have, that's the one form that they're never going to have. So this is my definition of the Jewish state. I think this is at the core of the battle right now. Do we give a resounding yes answer to the question of whether a Jewish sovereignty is a priority? And October 7th was very much designed to get us to question that.
Yes, you're going to have to. I'm giving you some exercise. The lady there with the hand up. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. I have been obsessively listening to each of you since October 7th, and to hear you in person, and this really is a therapy session for me, so thank you all for that. I guess on the topic of Jewish priorities, as a mother of young children, basically newly immigrated to Israel in the last 5 years, how would you speak to a civilian, to a Jew living in Israel, and what our Jewish priorities should be? Where you guys are kind of, you have the forum, you have the, you're making the big case for Israel, for the Jewish people. I feel like sometimes lost in what should our priorities be as, individuals. So that's the question, and just as a side note, I have a name for your Jewish ashram, Yossi, which is Ohel.
Oh, that's a good
one. Was it directed to someone specific, or just whoever wants to answer? Whoever wants to answer. So Jewish priorities as an individual. I think specifically as a recent immigrant, maybe making her way in Israel.
Look, I think that one thing that I often think about is, I spend so much time, I'm here in Israel, but I spend so much of my time on social media, so in very different mental spaces, right? So I'm here physically, but I'm reading news about what's going on in the US, all the stuff about anti-Semitism and Zionism, and it's, and it gets me upset or angry or indignant. And then I step out to take out the trash, and there are cats, and there are people around, who are talking about taking out trash in Hebrew. And, and then I walk down the path that we have here, Derech HaRakevet, and there are mothers with children, and they're speaking to each other in Hebrew. And I turn on the radio, and there are songs in Hebrew, and there's this song that was made after October 7th that was viewed millions of times, right, in this slangy Hebrew, harpudar, right? So, and I think, well, they all out there are so mad at us, and they hate us, and they want us to not exist. But every moment, actually, we continue to exist here, and we speak Hebrew, and we create culture in Hebrew, and it's like every step of the way and every minute that we're here, we create more of it. And I honestly think that we just need to keep doing what we're doing here, because I think we were doing something extraordinary in living this life here as Jews, however we understand it, in Hebrew. I find it really, truly extraordinary. That is, this is the case of my existence is resistance. So this is this is my answer to this question.
lot of questions. We don't have an awful lot of time, but we'll take one from the front, maybe from one of your fellow contributors. Is that Blake there?
Hi there. Long-time listener, first-time caller. I wanted to ask because most people here said when you were asked about your hopes for the future, you said that, you know, obviously the fights pre-October 7th will return, but we want to have more unity, more understanding, the ability to have more conversations. And I made Aliyah at a time when Israel was at each other's throats. And myself and a lot of young Israelis got caught up in it very deeply. And in our circles, we don't think it's possible that we are going to reach the stage of better conversations because we think, well, one side has to win. I think the judicial reform debate was a sort of smokescreen for much deeper issues in Israeli society, rather than just, you know, constitutionalism. And so I want to know, my question is that possible? The honeymoon period after October 7th, where we had an easier time speaking to each other because we're both Israeli, is it possible that that's sustainable, or is this going to, or is October 7th in fact a precursor to things getting much, much worse domestically?
So, Blake, I made Aliyah in the summer of 1982, which was the beginning of the first Lebanon War, when we were tearing each other apart over war. That was the first and only time that we've ever done that. And, you know, hi, I'm here, I'll come home. And people were shouting at each other in the streets, and it culminated in a grenade attack against the Peace Now rally, and Emil Grunzweig, who I later found out was a distant relative, was killed. And it was a very traumatic period. And in a way, you can draw a kind of straight line from there going up to the Rabin assassination. It's kind of one era. And yet, we discovered that we can still function as one people. And I didn't know if we would ever be able to come together around war. Again, war had always united us, and now war was tearing us apart. So that gives a certain kind of historical perspective where this is a very resilient society. Now, I think that this past year was worse. I think, and partly for the reason you say, because it was a smokescreen, as you put it, for deeper issues, but also because it wasn't just an ideological fight. We've had ideological fights. But this is a fight where certainly people like myself felt we were facing corruption and indecency. And it wasn't just an ideological issue. And that makes it impossible to reach some kind of a civil discussion. But I think that post-October 7th, at least my takeaway from this last year, is that what we need to do is rethink how we navigate power, internal power. In other words, in the 1990s, when the left came to power, it unilaterally imposed the totality of its worldview on the other half of the country. And it did so without real majority support for Oslo. It was at the beginning, but certainly as the Oslo process went on, the government had to effectively bribe Knesset members from the other side to vote for Oslo. And the Mitsubishi of Goldfarb, as we put it. And so there was something, and then this government came to power and claimed, well, we have 64 mandates, and so we can change the most fundamental rules of democracy. Well, this government actually did not win the popular majority vote. It won 49% of the vote. And even if it won 51%, you don't make such profound changes in the identity of the country that alienates the other half of the country. And so what we really need to do is think about new ground rules. First of all, we need new practical case of, is it going to be through a referendum? If you want to withdraw from Judea and Samaria, it can't be a 61-member coalition. There has to be a more substantial majority. If you want to limit the power of the court to the point where the court is subservient to the government and we lose the last of our checks and balances, that also requires a referendum or a substantial majority in the Knesset. So that's the practical goal. But there's also a spiritual component to that, which is if we're really serious about being a family, how does a family resolve its disputes? It's not through power. Power is when you deal with your enemies. It's not how you deal with your family members, unless you're on your way to a dysfunctional family. And we were. This past year we were. So I think that we've pulled back, and I do feel we're going to have a very different kind of conversation in a similar way that we pulled back after the Rabin assassination. And the country really did learn something. I won't overstate it, but we did learn something from that experience. And so I am hopeful. And I understand why you feel the way you do.
That I recall anywhere in which both sides waved the same national flag. And I think that, to me, that signaled something that was much more profound and unifying, because the entire country was mobilized by perhaps conflicting, but at least a belief in this flag and this nation and this project in one way or another. And I think that that's what suddenly emerged after October 7th to pull everyone together. There was something there beforehand that allowed October 8th Jewry to exist.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, okay? Let's go right to the back. The lady at the back, there was a hand up very high. I apologize for those that didn't get their questions asked. There's always more questions than time.
I want to direct my question to Yossi. Specifically, I was wondering if you have maybe a footnote for your essay for secular Jewish readers, and if there's a relationship between the kind of two branches of religion which you specify between like the more halakhic religion and like the different and the Echad, and these two states of existence in Israel of a religious Jewish realization of Jewish sovereignty and a secular Jewish sovereignty. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I'm sorry, it's hard for me to understand proper English. Did you understand?
Yeah, I can attempt to translate the British. This is my secret weapon. I believe the question was whether you can somehow reinterpret or translate your your vision for secular Israelis, to see how the two models that you put forward of Hadil and Echad, if they can also be somehow relevant for secular Israelis. Is that more or less okay?
Yes, that's very much.
Thank you very much. Even after 17 years here, I still get British.
I hope Paul won't have to translate my English for you. I think it depends what we mean by secular. Secular is an all-purpose term that we use here, often very imprecisely. There are secular Israelis who have no interest in religion, although many of them have a relationship with tradition, in a family context, certainly in national context, and that's very precious. That's the gradations of secularism really need to be unpacked. There's another form of what we call secular, which isn't secular at all. It's people who believe in God, people who say Baruch Hashem, Bezrat Hashem, people for whom God is a natural part of certainly one's culture. And so I'm not really looking to confine this vision to one part of the population. It's not for the Orthodox, it's not for the secular. I would hope that it would draw this institution that doesn't exist. I hope it draws Jews from across the spectrum, but I do think that what they all need to have in common is some hunger for God's presence in their life. And however one expresses that, however one expresses that denominationally, I don't care. I have my way of expressing it. But that's my way. And I think that in this era of Jewish history, there is no one form of Judaism that can or should monopolize. And it's also impossible, because we're what you were saying about democracy certainly applies to how we live our Jewish lives today. And so I would envision a center where all kinds of Jews could come together, and everyone will figure out their own relationship with halakha, their own relationship with what do you believe, what don't you believe, and all within the shared the shared premise that one can find a deep relationship to God in a Jewish language.
Okay, I think that brings this fantastic evening to a close. I'm really sorry some people have questions. If you want to ambush the speakers afterwards to try and grab the questions, you can. But please remember, books on sale outside. If you haven't already got one, then get one. That should be a Jewish priority. Thank you, everyone.